you guys enjoy your day off?
Yeah.
Did it stress any of you out? Maybe some of you, I was getting emails from people going, what do we do now? I'm like, chill, it's okay, these things happen. So, obviously we're not gonna have a test on Wednesday, we're not ready for it yet. However, I kind of set myself up for this eventuality. I had mentioned at the beginning of the semester that if we came across a situation where we were bumping into bad weather situations, that we had the option of doing the test online. That's what we're gonna do. So in order to make up for the time to keep us on schedule, we're just gonna do the test online. So I'm gonna be lecturing today and on Wednesday, and we'll just, then after Wednesday, I'll make the test available for you, and you'll have through the entire weekend. And I'll even make it so that you'll have a whole week to take the test. How's that? Make it so that you have a whole week, so that means that if you don't have access to a computer on Monday when you come in, you can take some time, lunch or whatever, I don't know what your life is like, but see if you can find some time on Monday or Tuesday or whatever day between end of the day on Wednesday and the following beginning of class on the following Wednesday. You'll have that time span available to take the test, okay? The nice part about doing it online is there's two reasons that's really nice. One, it eliminates the essay question, because I hate having to grade essay test questions online. So I eliminated the essay question entirely from the online version, so that's gone. And two, it's an open book test. Yeah. So that means that you can use your notes, you can use your book, whatever you need in order to get through the tests, because I can't sit over top of you and see if you're using your book. So it should make it easier for some of you to be able to take the test. It also means that you can, take your time about it. It will still be a time test, but it will be a little bit easier because you'll be able to have access to your notes. So of course study and do everything that you would normally do, but you also can have your notes alongside you when you're taking the test. Anybody happy about this? You guys all look kind of somber. Still have to do a test. Yes, you do. You also need to do an observation. That will be due same time frame. So we're just going to make it that same period of time that the test is open. That's when your observation has to be done also. So with that, let me see if I have my notes here on the observation, what I'm looking for in the observation. Do I have it? Yes, I do. I have a document here for observations and what that looks like. I'll run through that in a second. Before we go there, though, I want to do question of the day. So let's see if anybody's got some opportunities for points. And I can't remember names. Let me just do a quick roll call here, so I remember who names are. Mark Rio, I see. Christopher. I was putting you as a different name. Courtney. Okay. Anisha is not here. Anthony. Hey, I got it right. Kylie. No. Kylie. Is Kylie here? All right, not getting it. Mark. Okay. Trita, no. Where are you, Trita? Oh, there you are. Hiding in plain sight. Jan is here. Adam is here. Taylor is here. Brandon is here. Sage is here. Kelly is here. Shaden is here. Jessica is not here. Liz. You're Liz. Okay. It's not we've gotten it wrong. Cassidy is there. And Joseph. And Peter. Good. All right. Good. And I'm sorry. What was your name?
Kylie.
Kylie. Okay. Liz is not here. All right. So let's do question of the day. And Liz, you had a question. Go ahead.
What characteristic of Victorian aesthetic was briefly mentioned in last week's lesson?
What aesthetic of Victorian What trait of Victorian aesthetics was briefly mentioned last week? I'll accept any aesthetic of Victorian design. Anybody? Stan's
That's
scored
back
2 points. Go
tip of my
ahead.
tongue.
Go ahead, Sage.
Four vacui.
What's that?
Four vacui.
Is that one of the, okay,
That's one of
four vacui, very good. What does four vacui mean? Sage?
It's the fear or dislike of empty space.
Good. Anything you want to add to that? No? Anything you'd like to add to this? Okay, all right, so horror vacui. We're going to go into more traits of Victorian design as we go along today. I keep on wanting to go back to my computer, but I'm not ready for it yet. So, yeah, well, I don't want to even like embellish on this because we're going to talk more about Victorian design today and what we're seeing of it. Who else has got a question of the day? Let's see if we can treat. Go ahead.
I put, during the Industrial Revolution era, what form of media arose to question corrupt government?
Okay. What media rose to question corrupt government? Yes, go ahead.
Oh, it's newspapers. I mean, that's all they had back then. I mean.
Yeah, newspapers or tabloids?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you name one of the media that did this?
Oh, was it the Brennan newspaper?
A publication in particular. We're going to talk about it today.
Oh God, I know what you're talking about. It's on the tip of my tongue. Ah, shit. Oh man, I'll remember in 20 minutes.
What about you, Treat? Can you think of a publication that did this?
It was called The Caricature or something.
A caricature was the thing that was created by Thomas Nast, but can you name the publication that it was?
No.
It's a
Okay.
disaster.
Do you want to give us any other information about this, about caricatures?
No.
Okay, so from the reading,
I know-
you would have found this out.
It was in Chicago.
No, it was in New York.
Oh, okay. It was Times?
Harper's Weekly
Oh,
is the
okay.
name of the publication that we're going to talk about today. Thomas Nast was famous for like trying to
Boss
take
Queen.
down mob bosses and all kinds of corrupt officials and to point out the corruption that was going on in politics and political office. So,
Isn't it called Harper's Bazaar now or something? Or
yeah, it's got a new life. It's now Harper's Bazaar. Very good.
thank you.
All right, who else got a question of the day? Go ahead, Taylor.
What is a hoarding site?
What's a hoarding site, guys? Christopher.
A place where people could display their advertised print.
Very good, very good. And anything else that you want to tell us about hoarding sites? And we get extra points if you add into it. Taylor, anything else that you want to tell us about hoarding sites? Anybody else get an extra point? Yeah.
Yeah, basically they had to put them up like first thing in the morning, and then they sometimes had to come back and put them up again because people would cover all their stuff up. Because in England they were only used for, it was the only one spot in town they could do it, so it became like a social hangout occasion.
Cool. Yeah. So it's like social networking in those days. Anybody else have anything else they want to add to this? Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier how the posters, or last time we were here, you mentioned how the posters weren't made by like artists, so it was all like crumpled together and it looked pretty bad.
Mhm.
Everything was just lettering. I mean, there were some pictures, but it wasn't like very entertaining to look at.
Okay. All right. And how does that deal with hoarding sites? How does that relate to hoarding sites?
Because like basically, well, it shows like back then how they weren't as advanced. They were like good with like design, but then when I think it was lithography that started doing like drawing more and art, so it made things like more advertising friendly.
Yeah, more realistic interpretations, and people were attracted to illustrations that looked realistic. So that fit into hoarding sites by one degree. The fact that those hoarding sites created wood type and these crazy, plentiful, over the top kind of designs that they were doing for typography. That's kind of one of the things I was kind of pointing out. But it also fostered itself into the idea of lithography. And what they were doing was they carried on that same kind of typeface in lithography, that over the top kind of curly Q-ish typography that was showing up. Let's just look at one of those posters right now. Pull this up so that we can see, and I'm gonna use this also to kind of point out some traits that we see in Victorian design since we're talking here. Yeah. Oh, one too many, there we go. So maybe this will show up. Okay, here we go. So here's a lithograph, an example of a lithographed poster. And this gives us a good sense of what was going on with Victorian design. Because if we look at this, if we pay attention to it, it still has all those embellished typefaces that we were seeing in the wood type posters. And it still has the quality of horror vacui, which we described as fear of white space. Because where on this poster is there white space?
What white space?
That's right. What white space? It's taken up with an overall, the overall thing is filled with illustration. Now, there is white space within the illustration, and we have a lot more white space. But all the same, they still chose to, even with the illustration, to try to fill up the entire space. So there was that idea of plenty and lots of elements in the flourishes, the curly cues that we see on the letter forms, were very much part of the designs. And here, when we look at the tin cans that they were using, that they were able to lithograph onto these tin cans, we notice that, again, very little white space on the designs here. This entire thing is surrounded with a decorative border. We've got a decorative border up here, we've got a decorative border here, we've got a decorative border here, we've got borders here. We've got a border that's surrounding this with all of this leaf stuff around it. And every single one of these is border within border, frame within frame. There's nothing here that we would call plain at all. They're very embellished. Even here when they were taking wood type and putting it together and trying to make billboards out of it, the typography is still this kind of awful over embellished typography. And we've got this kind of stuff where we've got all of these different centers of hierarchy. And we have some white space moving through this, but trying to decipher what's the most important information to read here is still very difficult for us to do. So that was some of the traits that we see in these wood type, in actually all Victorian designs, is that fear of the white space, over embellishment of too many things, the patterns or too many typefaces or whatever we want to call it, or too much of that going on. Let me show you quickly what the observation assignment is and what you're going to be doing as far as citing sources. And this is also in the Blackboard, but I'm just going to point it out so that you guys are aware of what I'm looking for your observation assignment. First off, when you're finding an observation assignment, I want you to find a modern day interpretation of the thing that we're talking about. So in this particular case, your observation is going to be on Victorian design. That means that you're looking for either wood type posters or that overwrought, over-illustrated stuff that we saw before. We're going to look at more of it today and on Wednesday's class, but we're going to see that there's pattern on top of pattern on top of pattern, or decorative border inside of decorative border inside of decorative border, or very realistic kind of images that are filling all the way to the edges and not much space for clean white space, or for clean white information. Too much information, too much illustration. Those are the traits that we see in Victorian elements, in Victorian design. Regardless of what the images look like here, you want to make sure that you put your name, your date, and what observation assignment it is. And then you're going to load in two images. One is going to be your modern day interpretation of the thing that you saw from the past, and the other one is going to be the thing that you're trying to point to as the thing that you're comparing it to. So this will be the historical element. Believe it or not, this chair was from 1900. Crazy as it is, that was from 1900, that design of the chair, the Vienna Secessions, very modern in their approach. So it looks very modern today. But this cabinet is a modern day interpretation of some of the things that they were doing in that. And so what this is talking about is, the copy is telling that this is an example of how this fits in with arts and crafts. So it points out that this chair that's designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh influenced the design that's here. And it talks about all the things that were found in the stuff that Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and you guys are gonna get to know how the things that he did are apparent in this design. And it cites the book, your Eskilsson book, naming Eskilsson, there's the name of the author, and 85. That tells me what page in Eskilsson that fact is from. That's going to be important, because if you just say Eskilsson, that's the entire book. I don't know where in the book you found this little nugget of information. Essentially, it's just this little piece of information right here that this is being cited here. So I want to know when you're doing an inline citing like this, that's what it's called, an inline citing, that you're referencing the Eskilsson book, and you're telling me what page this is on. It's really important when you're doing. And then on top of that, you're going to give me the full citing. So maybe I've cited your Eskilsson book, but maybe you go to a website instead. So you're going to cite the website, and I need to know what that website is so I can pull it up, I can look for that information. We're not just making up stuff off the top of our head. Anytime we state a fact, we want to give a citation for it. Now, there are some rules to this that seem to make sense. Like if I were to say, this design is square because squares have 4 edges, everybody knows what a square is. We don't need to cite a source for how we know what a square is. A square has 4 sides. We get that. We don't need a citation for that. So you can leave that one go. But if you're telling me something about the life of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, that he did recurring themes with perpendicular and rectilinear components, and that he used leaded glass panels and minimum decorative devices. Well, that's not common information. Ask your mother. Does your mother know about Charles Rennie Mackintosh? Probably not. If your mom doesn't know about it, then you need to cite it, okay? But your mom probably knows what a square looks like, right? So you don't need to cite that. So anytime we're citing information that is not common knowledge, we need to give a citation for it. So that's why there's this little inline citation right here, and that's why we're doing this, because we're citing facts. This little document is really not just about your opinion, but it's actually using research to back you up, and that's what is probably the hardest part about this assignment, is just making sure that you're citing sources. Finding images, you can go on Etsy, you can go on Pinterest, you can walk through your grocery store, I don't care where you find your images at. Probably not something that you did or a friend did. I'm trying to stay away from personal works, but if it's someplace that's out there that's published, then you're going to find it. So one of my favorite places to go for Victorian aesthetics, including wood-type posters, is you can go to the grocery store. Walk around the grocery store sometime. You might see like chalkboards that are put up in grocery stores these days. It's pretty popular. Look at them. See if they remind you of wood-type posters. Or go down the aisle where they have wine bottles. Wine bottles have some great aesthetics in them, and especially if you look at the labels, you might see some that remind you of Victorian designs. Don't be afraid to go down any of the aisles and start hunting. You can find all kinds of stuff that are very reminiscent of Victorian designs. I also like going to Target. Target, especially in their home goods, their decorative goods, they have a lot of stuff that's very, very much either Victorian or wood type. So just go there. T-shirts have lots of these things on them. Tattoos are a great source for Victorian aesthetics. So don't be afraid to look for things that are beyond just stuff that you see in the hallways. Hunt a little bit for things that remind you of Victorian aesthetics. The thing I don't want you to give me is something that is a reproduction. What's it mean when I'm saying a reproduction?
Like a poster copy of it, like a Mona Lisa poster or something.
Yeah, so if it's something that was from the era, that's easy. I have that. I'm giving you that in the slides that I'm giving you. I'm showing you those pieces already. I don't want to see the things from the past. I want to see how these designs from the past are influencing design today. And that's what this assignment is really about. It's getting you guys to look at the things that we're studying in this class and seeing how they relate to things that are being designed now. So that means that if you see a house that is a Victorian style house, who cares? We can go into Lakewood, we can go into Cleveland Heights, we can find all kinds of Victorian houses there. that are authentic to the era. I don't care. But if you find something that is a modern house that's got some Victorian elements to it, that's a different interpretation. As long as it's not a complete reproduction, as long as it's not meant to look exactly like a Victorian house. So look at it, see if you can tell the difference between what's Victorian, what's authentic to being Victorian, and what's a modern day interpretation of it. What makes it modern, okay? So look at the way that the designer is, like if you choose a chair or something like that, see if you can find something that looks really sleek and modern looking to it. That looks like it was designed now, that is really cool and hip looking, not something like your grandma would have. Yes?
So in that vein, can you claim that steampunk is a modern interpretation of? Okay.
Yeah, I'm totally game with steampunk because they're taking modern twists to it. Like in steampunk, nobody wore mini skirts back in those days. They weren't wearing platform shoes that were this tall. They weren't taking hats and exaggerating them so that they were this tall. Steampunk is an exaggeration of that era, so steampunk totally fits with that.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, all right, so that's what I'm looking for, just to point out here, I'm just saying, add your name, make sure you show the present day version, show the old version. Make sure that you're citing the source where you found both the old finding and the new finding. So you're going to make sure that you're giving me a full citing here and a full citing here. For citings, if you're confused about how to cite, then you want to, there's lots of things called citation machines, and you can just Google search citation machine and plug it in, and it will give you choices of, you just plug in all the information that you have about what the website source is, what the name of the book is, and it will pull up the information for you and plug it all in. It'll give you all the information and put it in proper format. This is saying that here's the person that you're talking about, so this should correspond with what you're pointing out. This table is an example of arts and crafts with a modern twist. It appears this work by Susan Link. It may have been influenced by Charles McIntosh. Here's the inline citing. This is not an opinion, this is a fact. And here it corresponds to what the works cited list at the bottom. And then you're going to give the name of the author. This is what the citation machine will do, the title of the work, the publisher info, and again, making sure that I'm not even sure what I'm saying here, that the same format is used for the image citing. So what you do here, you're going to do up here too. Okay? Yes?
If we find something in our book that we'd like and wanted to use, would we be able to use that as a work citing?
Yeah, as long as you're citing it, yes, you can use your book for citing, totally fine with it, but the image that you're going to cite is going to be the older image, it's not going to be the modern interpretation. Unless you look back later in the back part of your book, maybe. So, anybody else, questions? Okay, so that's what we're looking for. Close that out, and let's go back into our lecture. All right, so covered a lot in a short span of time. Now we're going to introduce a new invention, the invention of photography. So, the invention of photography is not actually a new invention. Well, it is a new invention, newish invention. It happens in the 1800s, early 1800s. But the concept of photography is not a new one. It actually existed back in the days of Aristotle, around the 4th century BC. This observation of this thing called a camera obscura existed in that time. And what they discovered was that if you were in a darkened room, like they would see this happen, where if they were in a room and it was a dark room, and somehow like there was a crack in the wall or a hole in the roofing or whatever, what would happen is in that darkened room, anything from the outside world would project through that tiny aperture the hole that's coming in, and it would appear on one of the walls in the room. And this phenomena happens all the time. We see it, you can still see it today if you're in the right conditions. It comes down to the fact that the image on the outside is much, much brighter, and that's reflecting into that aperture, that small hole that's projecting. Usually it shows up upside down in that space. And so this is called a camera obscura. It was observed back in the 4th century BC by Aristotle. And from that time, they started to use the camera obscura, which comes to mean dark chamber. They would use them, or they would at least acknowledge them. By the time we got to the 16th century AD, we have this invention of the camera obscura that is used by artists for the sake of reproducing images. So it wasn't until we got to the 19th century when art started to change, that artists would go outside and paint outside. Before that time, art was considered a studio activity, and it didn't matter how good an artist you were. You might take your sketch pad and sketch outside, but you never actually painted outside. Most of them were working on these huge canvases that would take up a large amount of space, and so it wasn't convenient for them to do this. Plus, on top of it, the way that they painted before the middle of the 19th century was they would paint very precisely, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. So they weren't going outside to gain information about what the colors looked like or anything like that. They would just, if they were going outside, it was to do their sketching. But sometimes they had to do sketches that were accurate. And if anybody has tried to sketch accurately, to reproduce a scene, for example, a cityscape or whatever, and tried to do it accurately, you know it's very, very hard to do it with accuracy by freehanding it. So what they would do is they discovered that they could take this device, this camera obscura, park it in the location of where they were working from, take some tracing or tissue paper with them, parchment paper, it's kind of transparent, and they could lay it over top of this kind of window that they would create into the camera obscura. So the camera obscura would capture the image, it would slide into the dark chamber, and then it would bounce off of this mirror, and then from there, if you had a piece of glass over top of it, you could trace the entire scene. So they could get an accurate depiction of the scene that they were trying to replicate, and then they would take that into the studio and they would reproduce it at large size. They could do grids and all of that stuff to try to formulate this, but then they could do an accurate depiction of this. So they were using essentially a camera way back in the 16th century when this was first started to be used by artists as a studio device. There's a big difference between this and an actual camera, though. What's the thing that's missing here? Film. Film, yeah. The thing to capture, the closest that we have here is the guy that's actually tracing what he's seeing in this camera obscura. But it's not really, it's not reality. It's not captured forever. It's just meant to be a sketch. So there were people that were saying, I wish there was a way to capture the real world. There must be some kind of way, but they hadn't quite figured it out until this guy named Joseph Niepce figured it out. Now, Joseph Niepce had originally been just playing with the idea of reproducing a book that he had worked on. He was an artist. He had done a book, or had done a series of sketches, or actually drawings, or etchings actually, not etching, of drawings of bishops. And he realized, like, when he was through with this, that he wanted to reproduce this. He wanted to turn it into a whole book, and with all of these images in them. But then he also realized that he only had the one images that he had, and he couldn't go ahead and do lithography. That sort of existed at that time. But he really wanted them to be as accurate as his originals. He loved his originals. He didn't want to lose them. So he was trying to figure out a way to capture the actual images that he created, the drawings that he had created, and reproduce those rather than having to reproduce them into the lithostone. So he started playing around with chemistry, and this is a really long endeavor to get to the point where he could actually do this, and by that time he had invented all kinds of new things. This project became less interesting for him. But regardless of that, he discovered that there were materials that could, that had different properties when they became sensitized to light. One material in particular is called bitumen of Judea. bitumen of Judea, you don't have to memorize that or know that, but the quality of bitumen in Judea is this. When it is in a dark room setting or in a room where there's no light, it is soft and goopy, and I like to liken it to Vaseline, consistency of Vaseline, very soft, mushy kind of state that it's in. But when it got out into the light, when you took that bitumen of Judea and you put it on anything and you took it out into the light, it suddenly dried up. Kind of like how Elmer's glue dries up when it's exposed to air. Except in this particular case, it wasn't exposing it to the air that did it, it was exposing it to light that did it. So as soon as bitumen of Judea was exposed to light, it started to harden up. But any parts of the bitumen of Judea that weren't in the light stayed soft and goopy. So you could conceivably take bitumen of Judea and put a piece of black cloth over one half of an entire plate that was covered with bitumen of Judea, and that part that was covered over would stay soft and goopy, but the other part would dry hard, and you would have half of your image was hard and half of it was soft, because half of the areas was hard and soft. And then what you could do from there is if you took this back into a dark room and you washed off all of the wet, goopy bitumen of Judea, you could actually acid etch that plate that you had that was covered in the bitumen of Judea. So the parts that were covered with this hardened bitumen of Judea wouldn't be affected by the acid, but the parts that were soft, that had been unexposed, that were just bare metal, then the acid would eat through them. This is called acid engraving. And it became a part of the engraving process. So our engravers started realizing, we can start to cover things over and we can etch away at it. And so this is what he ended up doing. He took one of his drawings, and he realized that if you take a drawing, if you've ever done this, you had a cookbook or a piece of paper next to you when you're cooking, and you get grease that splatters on it, the paper becomes kind of transparent, So it's like you can actually read newspaper or something through it. Well, that's what he did. He took one of his drawings and he covered it with oil, let the oil saturate into it. The area where he had his charcoal drawing at was fine. It existed fine. But the paper itself became kind of transparent. So he had just basically made a negative for himself. So he tried this one time. He decided to take a piece of stone, or not stone, a piece of metal, and he covered it with the bitumen of Judea. He took his image, he laid it over top of it, he exposed it to the sun, and because the paper was now transparent, any place where the charcoal was at remained like the dark piece of cloth sitting over it. Everything there remained soft and goopy of the bitumen of Judea, but everything that was white, the piece of paper, became hardened. And then when he took it into the dark room and he would wash it all off and acid etch it, then all of those submerged areas would become the area that would fill up with the black ink, all the shadows. And so from that he could reproduce his image over and over and over again through this process that became known as heliogravure, or sun engraving. And so that became a really interesting way of solving this problem. But Joseph Niepce wasn't done with that yet. He realized that he could take this a step further, and he could pull in his camera obscura. So he did exactly that same thing. He pulled out his camera obscura, he took another metal plate, covered it with the bitumen of Judea, and then put that inside of his camera obscura. And then set it so that it was looking out in his courtyard and let it sit there. Now the bitumen of Judea took a long time to dry, so it was a many-hour process, and that's why this image looks as shaky and as disturbingly exaggerated as it does. It's almost unrecognizable what it is, but you can sort of see that there's a couple of buildings here and very elongated shadows, and that has everything to do with the fact that it took hours and hours and hours to do. It was capturing all of that. But ultimately, what he ended up with was an image that he could acid engrave, and he could reproduce this image over and over and over again. It's the first photograph. So it was discovered by Joseph Niepce in 1820. This says 1826, but it was 1822 or so that he first started his experimentation. By 1826, he had done this. He immediately published his findings. They went out to the French Academy, and people were reading about this. And at the same time, he started to form a friendship with another guy who was doing the same kind of experimentation. His name was Louis Daguerre. And Louis Daguerre and Joseph Niepce formed this kind of partnerships. They started to work together, and they change things around. They started doing new things with it. So instead of playing with this nasty material, bitumen of Judea, they started to work with silver, and they started